But I'd like to go ahead and start off by introducing our presenter this evening. Colonel retired L. Scott Lingamfelter lives in Woodbridge, Virginia, and attended the Virginia Military Institute, where he earned a BA in history in 1973. After graduating from VMI, he was commissioned in the regular Army and began a career as a Field Artilleryman and a Middle East Foreign Area Officer. In 1981, he completed his MA in Comparative Governments of the Middle East and Soviet Foreign Policy from the University of Virginia. After many positions, he retired in 2001 to pursue a second career as a legislator in the Virginia General Assembly, where he served from 2002 to 2018. Colonel Lingamfelter accumulated significant experience in the war-torn Middle East as a military observer with the United Nations Truce Supervision Organization in Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. He later served with the 1st Infantry Division during Operation Desert Storm as the executive officer of the Division Artillery that planned and executed the largest field artillery assault on enemy forces since World War II. A 1997 graduate of the U.S. Army War College, Colonel Lingamfelter now devotes his time to writing professionally and routinely contributes to the Washington Times on national security topics. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Colonel Scott Lingamfelter.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Well, first, let me just remind everybody I am an artilleryman, and that means I'm half deaf. So when you ask your questions, please make sure that I can hear you. First of all, let me thank the 1st Division Museum for inviting me to make this presentation, as well as their sponsorship for Desert Redleg. They were very helpful in that regard. And I'm also very grateful to Mr. Joe Craig of the AUSA book program, the Association of the U.S. Army, for all their help and encouragement and efforts in publishing Desert Redleg by the University Press of Kentucky. If you are not a member of AUSA, I should encourage you to join. They are a great outfit, and they do represent very much the best interest of our great Army. So without further delay, let's begin to explore Desert Redleg. First, a little bit about my background. I was fortunate to have 2 very interesting and engaging careers, particularly as a soldier, an artilleryman, and a Middle East specialist. However, after starting a writing career, I found that very, very rewarding. However, let me be very clear that being a grandfather is more fun. So why this book? This was really the first major conflict after Vietnam, but it also received footnote status in large measure because it unfolded so quickly. It was a decisive win, and it didn't have the same controversies associated with it that we see in other conflicts. Secondly, it was the right war for the right reason because it addressed unambiguous aggression. Third, it was also a real test of the doctrine developed to address a Soviet threat, but actually employed against a Soviet-equipped surrogate, in this case, Iraq. Fourth, I wanted to document the role of the field artillery in this war because nowhere else had the story been fully told. The contribution of the artillery in the First Gulf War has received, frankly, scant treatment, when in fact it was decisive during 8 days of raids and in firing a huge artillery preparation. Fifth, I wanted to share my perspective as the Division Artillery Executive Officer. I was on the ground. I had the opportunity to see the war unfold firsthand, and I wanted to share that. But I also wanted to do that from the perspective I had as a Middle East analyst. I had been assigned initially in the UN Truce Supervision Organization in 1981 and 82, so I had an understanding of the Middle East. I then went back to the DIA, where I was the Iran-Iraq war analyst, and did that job for 3 years. And in fact, I have a book coming out this is a shameless promotion, I might add. On the 4th of July, Yanks in Blue Berets, American UN Peacekeeping in the Middle East, which details that story of what it was to be an unarmed peacekeeper in the Middle East. And I'm very proud that AUSA supports both that piece of work, and it will be published by the University Press of Kentucky. You can get your orders in soon. So finally, I wanted to highlight the lessons learned that we acquired during the Gulf War, considering that it's very important to understand these if you are going to refurbish and renew your Army and make sure it's prepared for future combat. My primary sources, pretty straightforward, a little bit about them. I kept a diary and my boss, Lieutenant General retired Mike Dodson, did as well. He actually provided his journals to me, and I was very glad that they lined up nicely. He has a very engineer approach to things, and so they were very factual based. Mine were a little more flowery, but they lined up well, and I was glad that they lined up well because I didn't know what I would do if my boss's journal was misaligned with mine. I also had my original battle map, which I've given to the museum, and the 1st Infantry Division's operational graphics, copies of operations orders, fire plans, etc., all very useful and important in developing my timeline and validating events and places and so forth. And most helpful of all were the after-action reviews that I had from those subordinates that Colonel Dodson had put under my charge, and after the war, I was able to call upon those after-action reports to work in the detail and the facts to make sure that we had an accurate story to tell. The major characters in the book, these are the central characters. You can read them for yourself. I've included their retired ranks here. They were all quite successful, excellent officers, excellent people, and they were some of the finest people I ever served with in my military career, and I'll have more to say to them about them at the end of the presentation. This is the sandbox. This is the vast movement that we would make from the port of Dammam in Saudi Arabia to positions in the desert 465 kilometers west of the port. That is 289 miles. And it's from that location in the desert where General Norman Schwarzkopf crafted his big left hook that we would execute to knock the Iraqi army off its feet and then proceed eastward into Kuwait and liberate that country. No presentation on a conflict of this nature would be complete without a mission statement. For those of you in the Army, particularly, you know, everything has a mission statement. I mean, if you go to the motor pool to pick up cigarette butts, you'll have a mission statement. Well, we had a mission statement in the Gulf War, the division did, and you can see the divarties. The mission of the division was simply put, it was tasked to create this huge breach for the 7th Corps through which the other divisions of the 7th Corps would continue the attack into Kuwait. And our job in the 1st Infantry Division was to create that breach. The job of the Division Artillery, the statement below it, was to do that by laying down the fires necessary to attrit and destroy the enemy so that that breach would be successful. So, here are the major events that this book addresses. And as you can see, just moving through them rapidly, you can see the timeline. It was not a very slow-moving operation. It began in November of 1990, and actually 8 months later, after a great deal of high-tempo activity packed into that period of time, we had to accomplish things, and we did accomplish those things, and we did them very well. So by July of 1991, most of us were home, along with the 6,000 combat vehicles that we deployed to the Middle East and returned with. Now, these next series of slides will show how the war played out according to phases that I used in the book to describe how the battle transpired. So, first, you can see that we left the port. We went out to TAA Roosevelt, named after Teddy Roosevelt, who was one of the famous members of the 1st Division during the First World War. This shows that 465-kilometer movement from the port to TAA Roosevelt. This location was designed specifically to deceive the Iraqis as to the direction that we would take into Iraq. It would look like from here that we should just do a hard right, and go straight north into Kuwait. That's exactly what Schwarzkopf wanted the Iraqis to think, but that is not what we would wind up doing. Indeed, we would cross that large geographical area known as the Wadi Abatin, which would have been that line straight north pretty much. This portrays the 160-kilometer movement, the initial jump from TAA Roosevelt to our pre-attack positions opposite the Iraqi 26th Infantry Division that was blocking our way into Iraq. We then moved forward into the breach area to conduct our attack on the 24th and the 25th. I should say prior to that, it's from these locations that we did 8 days of continuous artillery raids, consuming a great deal of firepower to destroy the enemy. And then after we did those 8 days of raids, then we did the preparation and the breach operation into the 26th Division. After the breach, the 1st Division received orders to continue the attack into Iraq, another 115 kilometers deeper into the country, to attack the Iraqi Republican Guard situated on Objective Norfolk. A little difficult to see that, but it's in the right-hand side of that red oval was Objective Norfolk. We then attacked another 80 kilometers into Kuwait proper to complete the liberation mission. This was extremely challenging desert terrain that we had to cover, and in some cases, our vehicles were so heavy, they sunk into the sand, making maneuver extremely difficult. Finally, well, I should say finally, but we then were ordered to advance 35 kilometers north to clear Safwan airfield in Iraq of a remaining Iraqi tank brigade and establish a peace talk site at that airfield. This was a very interesting engagement, and my colleague and good friend Colonel Greg Fontenot addresses this in his book, The 1st Infantry Division and the U.S. Army Transformed, The Road to Victory in Desert Storm, which encompassed the period 1970 to 1981. You should get that book. You should get that book and read it if you are a real lover of the 1st Division. That is a great book to read because you'll get a real flavor for how the division got to the place where it would execute this remarkable operation in 1991. I also shared my view of this Safwan airfield battle from the perspective of the Devarti. Then after the peace talks, we actually moved back into Iraq, another 150 kilometers, to occupy positions to await Saddam's capitulation or to be prepared to resume hostilities. Finally, and blessedly, we made a 2-day 150-kilometer movement back into Saudi Arabia. In sum, all of these movements from January to April 1991 amounted to 1,200 kilometers. Quite a march, all of which I describe in this book. Now, I won't cover this in any detail. I do in the book, but it's important to understand the tremendous contribution that was made by the artillery to support the Big Red One. And this slide shows it. The roll-up at the bottom says it all. Within the 5 brigade-sized artillery organizations that composed the force artillery under the 1st Division, that included 2 from U.S. forces in Europe, 2 from U.S. forces in the United States, and 1 from the United Kingdom, Great Britain. There were a total in that force of 17 battalions of artillery supporting the 1st Infantry Division. This was a major decision to the credit of the 7th Corps Artillery Commander to support the 1st Division's breach of the Iraqi defensive positions. It was also, frankly, an unprecedented assembly of artillery that we had not seen in these numbers since World War II in any operation. And Colonel Mike Dotson and his DeVarty team had the mission to make all of this come together effectively. Now, here's some pictures from the book. And we have several pictures in the book. Everybody likes pictures in the book, but these are particularly interesting ones. They portray the 155 howitzers and multiple rocket systems that we used to fire both our raids and our preparation. And they were quite busy throughout the entire war. Now, the artillery raids. I would draw your attention to some key points on this slide. The 8 days of raids were a combined arms operation. That is to say, it involved maneuver forces, air defense, intelligence, signal. All of the key components of combat power were brought together to work in these raids. Even though it was an artillery raid, we nonetheless depended on a combined arms team, synchronized, to ensure that we could successfully execute this mission. So, for Colonel Dotson, the raids had several purposes. First, to destroy the enemy. Second is to test the enemy's response. The third, to practice counterfire on the enemy if it came about. And fourth, to train our units and headquarters in tactical movements and fire control while giving our soldiers the experience of fighting in combat conditions to test their mettle. Dotson gave each one of those headquarters, each one of these headquarters, an opportunity to lead one of the raids. Each day we would choose another brigade to do that. And why did we do that? So we could exercise that brigade's own command and control and personnel systems in the event that we might need to transfer power to them in the middle of the battle. But our primary effort was directed at destroying the Iraqis' ability to use artillery on us while preparing the way for the 1st Division to open a huge breach to allow the 7th Corps divisions to continue the attack deeper in Iraq. This is a schematic. Back in those days, before we had a whole bunch of computers, we used pencils and paper and antiquated things like that. And this is a schematic of the raid operation. Here depicted are the graphics that we used in the 8 days. Note that we elected to use long-range shooters, the 8-inch howitzers. How many of you have any association with the old 8-inch howitzer system? Okay, 2 of us. I'll buy you a drink later. And they could shoot 27 kilometers. They were long tube 8-inch. And the MLRS could shoot 27 kilometers for the 8-inch and 32 kilometers for MLRS. And the 155 systems we used for closer in targets, and they went out to about 23.5 kilometers. So what were the results? Here are the raid results, and without a doubt, the force artillery did their job in destroying much of the enemy's capability, as I describe in detail in the book. Almost nothing has been written of any of this, which is why I wrote the book. During the raids, we fired 9,000, these are during the 8-day raids, we fired 9,208 cannon shells and 1,606 rockets. Now, each rocket of that 1,606 contained 644 individual submunitions in each rocket. And that works out to 1,034,264 submunitions on the enemy. It was a bad day to be in the Iraqi army. That's a lot of firepower. And it was vitally important to the Army, it's vitally important to the Army today to take note of what worked in the past and will be needed again in the future on future battlefields, namely overwhelming artillery firepower and massed fires to shock and destroy our enemies. Now, the preparation. We then fired an additional 6,136 rounds and 414 rockets in a 1-hour preparation that sealed the fate of the 26th Infantry Division, the Iraqi division. We used our 8-inch howitzers again for deeper targets and on the flanks, but particularly the left flank, and I'll show that schematic to you in a minute, where there were more hardened targets, dug-in bunkers and so forth. I would also note that we had to position our supporting field artillery brigades such that we could get them moving after the preparation and married up again with their parent divisions, because those brigades, once we were done firing the preparation, would return to the other divisions. And so we had to quickly transition them out of the 1st Infantry Division's area so that they could get to their supported divisions in time to continue the fight with them. I'll tell you a quick story. Mike Dodson took the 1st UK Division Artillery, which would have been wound up way back behind their division had he not thrown them forward early into an area that we had created, a safe zone. And in doing that, he ensured in positioning the UK artillery that when the UK division went north and continued the attack, their artillery was already set up in an area where they could support that forward movement. It was very prescient and very important. And to this day, General Dodson and I are concerned that the artillery community needs to understand how to maneuver its forces on the ground to facilitate future operations. This is something that we just continue to need to work on, particularly in a high-speed combat environment. Here's the schematic, similar to the one in the raids that we used for the preparation. I was really saying to the museum, I was saying to Laura, I really feel bad. I should give the museum those 2 schematics. If nothing else, it would remind some of the high-tech people that you don't necessarily need a cell phone to be successful in combat. Okay. On this slide, you will see the results of the division and the DeVardy's efforts. Tom Rames, quote at the top, just moments before the preparation was fired on the 24th of February, almost 32 years ago today. Not literally today, but a few days ago. And his quote says it all. And read below is a snapshot of what we accomplished when a combined arms and synchronized combat power team was brought together and brought to bear on the enemy. And this is a lesson. This is a lesson for today's Army that we must sustain. Of note, fully 25% of all of the 155 millimeter rounds fired in all of CENTCOM, in the entire theater, were fired by the Big Red 1 DeVardy's 3 direct support battalions. And you can see that in the bottom right. So, ammunition expenditures, I've sort of beat this to death, but you can see the total number again at the bottom right. A lot of firepower. A lot of firepower was used, and artillery is important in that respect. Okay, total destruction, you can say that a picture is indeed worth 1,000 words. Note the POWs at the center. Interestingly, our DeVardy Command and Control TOC, our Tactical Operations Center, captured 400 prisoners, and we were sort of a staff section, so you can imagine what a day that was. When you've got 60-some Americans trying to handle 400 POWs, all eager to surrender at that point. The ones that had experienced that firepower decided that the better part of valor was to surrender to the United States. So, a ceasefire was called the morning of the 28th of February, and our Assistant S3, Major Tom Conran, and I were glad to shed our chemical protective gear that we had worn for several days on a knoll west of our new position in Kuwait. And no, if you look carefully, I do not have a helicopter landing on the top of my head. But it was an interesting anomaly in that picture, but it's the best one I've got. So here I smoked a celebration cigar that my brother-in-law sent me from Richmond, Virginia. Fortunately, that logistical system worked very well. Okay, our challenges, and I'm just going to kind of go through some of these. We had many challenges during the war, but I will highlight just a few here. They range from escaping the port to logistics, ammunition and fuel availability, being aware of which artillery units would support the DeVardy. There was a lot of discussion about that. You know, which unit would actually come to us. We finally settled on those 5 brigades and the 17 battalions, which was very, very good. Chief among our challenges was control of this huge number, 17 battalions. that was unprecedented for a Divardi to orchestrate in modern combat. I would highlight just logistics as a major challenge, and the efforts of our chief logistician in the 1st Division, Colonel Bob Shadley, Major General retired, was utterly superb. Now, one of his big bosses, Lieutenant General Gus Pagonis, the CENTCOM logistician, in fact, pushed a lot of supplies into theater, but the infrastructure and the system that was available to us was simply insufficient to move these supplies effectively to the field for distribution. But these are some of those challenges. If you've got any questions about any of these, you can refer back to it, make a note now, and I'll be glad to try to muddle through the best answer I can give you later. Okay, major lessons. Here are some of the key lessons we learned. The annual return forces to Germany exercise that we would do for NATO, the annual Reforger, prepared us well to get into our desert theater of operations because we had those skills. We knew how to load. We knew how to unload. We knew how to prepare ourselves. We knew the kinds of things that soldiers need to prepare for before they go into a combat theater. But we were unprepared to deal with the confusion of the port. I created this acronym, MESS, military equipment scattered senselessly. That's what it was like in the port, trying to locate, your Humvee and the deuce and a half to your battery and your vehicles. They were scattered all together. And what made matters worse, it was not only the 1st Infantry Division in the port, but it was the 1st Cavalry Division and the 1st Armored Division that was loading in the same port. So every vehicle began with the numeral 1. And that was a mess, indeed. That's a great quote, by the way. And I would simply say that logistics infrastructure was absent, making resupply very difficult. Command and control of a large artillery force is difficult. But I got to tell you, Mike Dotson and his team did a remarkable good job. This highlights, by the way, the significance of the Divardi commander. The Army actually got rid of Divardis for about a 7-year period during the counterinsurgency things that we were doing. They brought it back, I think, in 2011. But what a mess that was. The Divardi commander is very, very important. Artillery, mobility, difficulty to keep up with some of the fast-paced systems, but the Army, the good news is the Army's working on this. They are actually producing artillery and rocket launchers that can keep up with these tanks and Bradleys. So that's a very good development. Fratricide is always an ever-present problem, and unexploded ordnance is also a big problem. We expected, by the way, about a 5% malfunction rate among some of our ordnance systems, our submunitions. You ready for this? It wound up 23%. And so in many ways, those submunitions became like self-laid minefields for us to have to traverse. It was difficult and dangerous. Artillery survivability needs engineer support. There's simply not enough to go around. But you need engineer support to dig ammunition revetments and so on. And going home, the port support activity, you have to have the right skills. We actually developed a team that did this. Tom Rain put me in command of it, and it worked very, very well, and we were able to get the division back in good order. Now then, did we get the job done tactically? Clearly, air-land battle doctrine that was developed by Vietnam veterans in the 1970s worked. That was a real testament to how they sought to improve the Army after the Vietnam War. The well-vetted logistics that we used in Europe and in Asia, however, was a different story. It was not easily adaptable to the desert where there was very little infrastructure. The war highlighted the need for the Divardi, as well as the Field Artillery brigades, to have a peacetime association so that they were trained during peacetime for eventual combat together. This is very important that you create these kinds of associations in peacetime. Joint operations among the services was completely validated, particularly between the Army and the Air Force, close air support. There were other issues with fire support coordination measures that weren't quite as smooth, but close air support worked well. And the Army, of course, was at its best in the 1990s, in my opinion, in terms of training and readiness, and that showed up on the battlefield. But there were holes in deploying and redeploying, and I suspect much of that has been addressed. I sure hope it's been addressed. So how about the strategic level? How did we do there? Now, turning to that, I have to say that President George H.W. Bush's assembly of the 35-nation coalition was brilliant, in a word, brilliant, and he kept it together, even as Israel was tempted to get involved when attacked by Iraqi Scud missiles. He provided great flexibility to commanders on the ground to get the job done and allowed them to do so, planning with permissive rules of engagement and excellent operational security. U.S. dominance and military power was a huge message to the world. We must never lose that capability or posture, particularly in the eyes of our chief competitors, but also those who would engage in aggression that impacts our vital national security interests. So how about geopolitically? How do we do there? I take a look at this, and I ask some questions, and they're hard questions. Did we advance the family of nations concept in the New World Order imagined by President Bush? Would we have fought a subsequent war in Iraq had we eliminated Saddam then once and for all? Were we agile? Were we agile enough in adapting the coalition to emerging conditions that may have presented themselves for exploitation? I discuss all of this in my final chapter, but please don't read ahead. No cheating is allowed. The bottom line is, I do think that this is a point of discussion that we need to have, but that assessment is up to each of you, the reader, to decide what you believe on the facts. I report, you decide. Okay, I just got behind myself here. Okay, some final thoughts on lessons learned. As I've noted earlier, there are many lessons learned from the Gulf War. Moreover, there are emerging ones from the Ukrainian war. Now is the time to examine these lessons as we modernize after years of counterinsurgency combat to address our requirements to fight and win in the next conventional war. The key to success is to reach back, you see, and harvest what we know worked as well as what we are seeing currently today that can also work in the future. You see the point? You have to learn your lessons and bring them forward, and at the same time be observant about what is going on around you so that you can adapt to those new lessons. In Desert Redleg and research like it are important tools in reaching back to understand. And this is the point, you see. If you go forward best in this process by going back first. And this is something I hope the Army doesn't forget as we tangle ourselves up with all kinds of new technology and so on and so forth. We have to have reference to what we know worked in the past and adapt it to what we know is required today. Okay. So, do past and present conflicts, what do they mean for the Army today? First, the Army is modernizing the artillery for greater range and lethality. That is a good thing. And as we do, we need to harvest all those lessons we've learned. And what is really important is as we modernize, is that we sustain the doctrine we know works in the fire support arena, including how we configure the artillery for combat to support maneuver forces, as well as tactical and technical proficiency of artillery units. And I would just make this point. I say to my maneuver friends, and I have many in the 1st Division, that the only reason the artillery exists is to support the scheme of maneuver. And that is why we need a vital artillery to ensure that maneuver is successful on the battlefield. Finally, we must learn from the Ukrainian war and adapt the new lessons. In this regard, let's examine what we did as an artillery force in the Gulf War, and to the extent we can observe it, what the Ukrainian forces we are supporting in Ukraine are doing in the artillery fight there. Now, I'm going to come off script a little bit here to take you through some of this thinking. On the right-hand side, you're going to see the lessons of the Gulf War. And then I'm going to sort of contrast that a little bit based on what I have observed in my reading. Now, look, I don't have access to classified material. I'm reading what you're reading. I'm reading newspapers, I'm reading journals, I'm reading studies, I'm reading reviews, and I'm gleaning from those what I think I see going on in Ukraine. If you don't agree with what I have to say here, well, have a good evening. But it's my observations, and I could be wrong. And if I am wrong, I hope that someone can show me that I'm wrong so I can be right at the next presentation. In the Gulf War, we employed all sorts of intelligence in targeting the enemy. We're seeing the Ukrainians using cell phones, civilians, reporting on enemy locations, and the commercial off-the-shelf drones for targeting the enemy. In the Gulf War, we effectively employed the 270 MLRS rockets and the ATACMS systems, the long-range missiles, against enemy targets throughout the depth of the battlefield. The Ukrainians are doing a fairly good job with the US HIMARS and the MLRS launchers that have provided them with the precision-guided munitions against the enemy, the Russian forces, and they're doing a fairly good job at it. Now, they don't have all they need, but they're doing pretty good with what they have. In the Gulf War, we used what we called scoot and shoot tactics. In other words, get in, shoot, and then move quickly before the enemy shoots back at you. Shoot and scoot tactics employed during the artillery raids in particular. We went forward, did the shooting, and left and got out of the area. The Ukrainians are using this very effectively with their HIMARS. Their HIMARS are surviving quite well because they are, in fact, using scoot and shoot in their routine fire missions. They're even trying to do that with their cannon artillery, which is difficult to do. But survivability moves are very important. By the way, the Russians are not doing survivability moves as well, and they are suffering because of it. The British used a UAV. They brought it with them to the Gulf. The American forces had no UAV. I mean, at the division level, we had some, I think, at higher levels, but at the division level, we didn't have a UAV. The Brits did, and when they came over to support our division artillery, they brought the UAV with them. And so we would fly it out there to see what damage we were doing to the Iraqis. Guess what? The Ukrainians, this is all about UAVs. They're using the US Switchblade system, which is armed, that can loiter and then shoot down at tanks and destroy tanks. They're using the Turkish-produced Barakat and the commercial off-the-shelf UAVs to locate, destroy, and conduct battle assessments. They're doing very, very well at that. The attack of Iraqi artillery and associated assets throughout depth was something we did on the battlefield, from the front lines to the depth of the battlefield. The Ukrainians are, in fact, attacking the Russian artillery kill chain, that is, from the cannon on back to fire direction and target acquisition and so on and so forth. They are making an effort to attack that kill chain, but where they've been particularly effective is blowing up Russian logistics and ammunition sites, and that has been very effective. We employed in the Gulf mass fires, and I'll show you pictures of mass fires. Mass fires continue to be important, but we also had unguided conventional projectiles and a limited amount of first-generation precision-guided munitions like the rocket launchers on unit-level targets. The Ukrainians, however, are using unguided projectiles, mass fires, on a much smaller scale. Frankly speaking, they're constrained by the amount of ammunition they have. They fire maybe a fifth of what the Russians are able to shoot at them, so they're really outmatched in that regard. But they are using the improved precision-guided munitions that we have provided them and the NATO allies have provided them to great effect, and these are being proven on the battlefield every day. In the Gulf War, our fire control system was netted in a computerized digital system over secure tactical nets. The Iraqis, or rather the Ukrainians, tend to use platform-based systems, cell phones, tablets, and onboard computation on each of the systems. That's not as effective when it comes to doing mass fires and tactical fire control, but it's working. It's working as best as it can under the current configuration. We conducted detailed comprehensive fire planning using groups and series. If you're not an artilleryman, that might not make any sense, but just a way of configuring the attack of several targets at one time, schedules of fire. The Ukrainians haven't shown a lot of evidence that I have seen anyway with respect to detailed fire planning, but use of the fires to effectively cover minefields has been observed. And so they're picking up on some of the field artillery tactics that we use here in the United States. We practiced combined arms, force protection, and air defense. As I said, when we did the raids, the Ukrainians are doing a great job with this. They're using man-portable air defense systems to go out with their HIMARS launchers to protect those very valuable systems from attack by UAVs and other fast movers that the Russians have. So they're doing some good, smart things there. Virtually, the Iraqis had no cyber at all to deal with. Plus, we destroyed most of their communications early on with the Air Force and the Army raids and so forth. We had very good, frankly, very good systems, encrypted systems that they couldn't really interfere with. The Russians have a very good cyber threat. However, the Ukrainians have been able to mitigate that somewhat by the thousands of US portable encryption devices that have gone to them, along with SpaceX's provision of a satellite internet constellation. So this is really a new twist in war, where the private sector decides to get involved with the good guys. We had a heavy reliance in the Gulf on well-developed and effective artillery doctrine. The Ukrainians less so, but they are moving to more effectiveness in fire support operations with much innovation. There is a great deal of battlefield innovation going on in Ukraine, and my hat's off to them. So we, the United States Army, needs to take note of some of these innovations and learn them and incorporate them and adapt them to our future. Then and now, this was the drone, the UK drone that I referred to from the 1st UK Armored Division. I think my good friend, Major Rick Radis, is looking in from the United Kingdom tonight. I think he's online actually watching. So Rick, shout out to you for helping us with that UAV. It was really cool. And of course, this was what the Ukrainians have now. They're developing stuff, even as we speak now. They're copying it from what they see in the world. But these are the kinds of systems under which they're strapping munitions, and they hover over the Russians and drop the munitions down in their foxholes. I mean, it's kind of a remarkable thing. Okay, air defense. You see the oval on the left-hand side? That's a soldier with a man-portable air defense system. Look what's out in the wheat field, a platoon of HIMARS launchers. So that guy's at the ready in the event that there's an air defense threat to this very important asset. And so we need to up our game in the U.S. Army to ensure that we have sufficient air defense coverage. And quite frankly, this is one of the casualties, in my view, of our counterinsurgency years. We've let some of these systems atrophy. We don't have the robust air defense that we probably truly need. HIMARS, I'll simply point out to you that That is a great system. I actually was the DoD test officer for the HIMARS system back in the 1990s. Very, very excellent system. And I commanded a battalion of these, 36 launchers in the 2ID. Very effective and working very well. Although, while the U.S. has provided the HIMARS, in fact, it's been the United Kingdom, Germany, and Norway at this point that are providing the tracked version of the MLRS system. Now, this is hard to see, but in that oval is what mass fires of conventional rounds looks like. I took this picture in 1978 in South Korea when we did a firepower demonstration south of the DMZ. That's a battalion. That's a battalion of dumb rounds. And mass fires isn't going away anytime soon. This is shock and awe. And you drop this on an attacking tank company, and they will find a way to go in another direction. Okay, some personal reflections. Now, finally, I would simply point out that first, this is a war that really none of us thought that we would fight. And it speaks loudly to planners today as to why we must be ready for any contingency. Tom Rain was a superb division commander. Those of you who know him, I'm sure you agree, he was true, for him, there truly was no mission too difficult. Mike Dotson was one of the most competent professionals that I ever met and served with, and no doubt this couldn't have been done, in my view, as well as it was without him. RS3 Ed Cardenas was the most unflappable and focused soldier among us. We are dear friends to this day. My driver in that picture, Roger Lee McGarry, PFC Roger Lee McGarry, was a soldier through and through. He was always at my side, did great things. Our direct support battalion commanders, Harry Emerson, John Gingrich, Lanny Smith, were all superb. The DeVarty staff and NCOs were the very best, and all of them lived up to the mission of the motto of the 1st Division, no mission too difficult, no sacrifice too great, duty first. Okay, here's my paid advertisement at the end. I'm sure you've heard that that which doesn't kill you will make you stronger. But there's an exception. The artillery will actually kill you. And so that's my parting shot there. Here are your Desert Redlegs who did so much to write this story, Desert Redleg, and I hope you'll get a copy and pore over it with the same vigor these Redlegs did in their fight on the desert floor of the Middle East. Here's how you can purchase the book. You can purchase it any way you want. You can purchase it back here at this desk, and I'll be happy to sign it for you. If you don't leave with a book, I'll haunt you in the next life. And if you don't want a book tonight, or you know someone who might like an autographed book, you can order it directly from me, and I sign it, personalize it as you want it. I kid my Air Force buddies that I'll say something really nice about them in the book if they'll buy it. In any case, autographed and personalized at copybookwarrior.com, where you can get a copy. So, thank you very much. And now we will do questions and answers, and I appreciate your attention. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So again, just a reminder to our friends who are joining us virtually online, you can go ahead and get us those questions by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. For those of you who are joining us in person, everybody say hello to Jacqueline. She'll be carrying around the microphone for you. You'll let Jackie know that you have a question by raising your hand. But I'm going to go ahead and get us started off with a question from online, all the way from our friends in the United Kingdom, to which I say, good morning, sir. Your first question is, during the campaign, what was your major challenge working with Allied artillery?
That is a really good question, and that's from Major Rick Radis, UK Army retired, Field Artilleryman, wonderful fellow. In fact, he is a member of the Society of the 1st Division. He joined last year and came out to be at the officers' dinner. Because the UK fought with the division, he's entitled to be at the officers' dinner. You know, it's an interesting question. I don't know that we had a lot of big challenges, Rick. The truth of the matter is, because the UK and the American troops and NATO, along with the French, all trained on a standard NATO system, our operations work together quite well. And I found personally working with the Brits was like just working with another U.S. artillery brigade. They knew what to do. We trusted them to do it exactly right. They were well trained. So it was, I think, a prime example of why alliances matter and why it's important for us to continue strong alliances with our European friends, particularly those of our feather, of those who believe in democracy and believe in international law and believe in collective security. It's very important that we maintain these strong alliances. And so, Rick, I would say to you, I don't think we had a lot of challenges. I think we had a lot of blessings, frankly speaking. Yes.
Thank you, Scott. A very good presentation. I served with the 1st Cav in Vietnam, and I had a very interesting MOS. I was a computer repairman for the artillery. Have you ever heard of the FADEC computer?
Oh my gosh.
Okay, so
it was the first computer I worked on.
Yes. Okay. Well, my question is, it was a very bad place to start using personal computers.
Are you trying to make me feel old?
Well, I'm older too, okay. So that's fine. We're equal. And I had to go out to the FDCs every once in a while and fix one. And so my question is, and you mentioned TAC fire, is the evolution of is to not bring a computer into the FDCs anymore, but use networking to set the guns, or do they still bring computers into the FDCs, or are they part of the gun now, or how has it evolved from the FADEC?
It's evolved greatly. Much of the computation now takes place at the firing unit, right on the cannon itself or on the launcher itself. The challenge, we used to talk about technical and tactical fire control. The technical piece were the ones and zeros, the computational stuff that we did. I started off in the artillery doing manual computation, with slide rules and the whole thing, and we did it really fast. And we did it really accurately too, I might add. I don't think I killed anybody in many years that I wasn't supposed to kill. But then we went to a digitized system, and these headquarters at the battalion level became more tactical fire control. Where is the unit? Who's going to fire? But the actual data computation technically was done in a computer, either down at the battery level, and now it's gone down to the actual individual units. That's a good news, bad news story. For an old artilleryman, I would tell you that the key to success in combat is to be able to fight in a degraded mode. And when the GPS fails, you need to be able to do things the old-fashioned way. And unfortunately, the Army's gotten rid of its ground survey systems. And so now, I asked a young lieutenant a couple of years ago at Fort Riley, what happens when your GPS fails? And he pulled out his cell phone. Well, I've got this. And I just reminded him, I think the same GPS that's running that cell phone is going to give you trouble on your launcher as well. So in any case, the Army, big Army, needs to think about technology and backup systems that work when technology fails. I got to tell you, if the satellite system went down in Ukraine, they'd be in a mess right now, which is why Elon Musk is kind of a hero in that country these days. Okay, another question.
Our next question comes to us from online. It is about a story in the book. When the Scuds began falling on the port, they understand that you drove alone across town to get to the port and make sure that operations continued. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what made you do that?
What was the first part of the question?
When the Scuds began falling on the port, they understand from the book that you drove alone across town to make sure to get to the port and make sure the operations continued. What made you do that?
I didn't want to stay in one place where a Scud would fall on my head. Actually, Ed Cardenas and I were at Cobar Towers when the first Scuds came in. He and I quickly got together. I got my driver, and young McGarry, and Ed piled into the Humvee with me. I think we had Tom Conran with us, who was the assistant S3 as well. And we all dashed to the port because we knew that when the Scuds were starting to fall in the port, we really had to escape the place. We had to get out of there and get in the field because we were in an absolutely terrible place. I mean, you do not want to be sitting in a port while Scuds fall on you. But it seemed to me the right place to be was at the point of attack, and for me the point of attack was in the port, quickly limbering ourselves up and getting out in the field. And we were able to do that. It took several days to do it. It was maddening, but we were able to get out in good shape, because an army is designed to be in the field. It's not, the Navy can be in a port, the Army cannot be in a port. We just did not, you had all that force concentrated in one area. We had big crosshairs on us, and we had to get out of there, which is why I dashed there. But Ed Cardenas came along with me. He was, by the way, a lot of people wanted to come with us, and Ed tells a great story about how all of them were standing there looking like puppies in a kennel, wanting, pick me, take me with you. I want to go to the port too. But we couldn't pile everybody into one Humvee, so that's why we did it. Yes.
Good evening, sir. Lieutenant Commander Eric Grauender. I'm a surface warfare officer, which means I drive ships, shoot guns.
And you shoot guns. This is good stuff.
Oh, yes, sir. I've shot 76 millimeter on the old Oliver Hazard Period class frigate, and then the 5-inch on the Arleigh.
You know what cordite smells like then, don't you?
Oh, yes, sir. But two questions, not too far in depth, though. The first question is you had made mention November 1990. Your unit got the call to go forward in the Middle East. Now, in the Navy, we have ships that go through a training cycle. And at a certain point, this ship will not deploy. It needs maintenance. It needs to be certified in basics before it can go overseas. In fairness, how ready was your unit? Was your unit fully trained? Did you have to train on the fly? Or?
I didn't plant this question, but it is so good. And you can read about it in the book. Because we were very fortunate in the 1st Division. Tom Rame had us leaning forward in the foxhole. Tom Rame always had us leaning forward in the foxhole. And he encouraged the division to get itself ready, even though we hadn't even been put on the alert roster yet. And in fact, some people said, well, the 1st Division is not a candidate to go. We have a backup mission to do Reforger, to go to Germany, event there's a war there. Tom Rame didn't think that. He leaned forward. Now, it happened that in the summer of 1990, we were going through in the DeVarty our annual IG inspection process. And that is, it's a big pain in the butt when you have an IG inspection in the Army. Inspector General, they come down and they're checking your mess kits for rust and all this jazz. One of the best things that can happen to you before you go into combat is to have an IG. Because you're out there checking everything to make sure it's working properly according to the book. That was fortuitous for us. But as soon as we got the alert, we went into a very aggressive training mode where we were out on the ranges. We were doing all kinds of things. At the same time, we were painting vehicles, sand. I mean, a tremendous amount of preparation in a short amount of time. Tell you a quick story. So the Army had a bunch of captured Soviet equipment from Afghanistan, the first Afghanistan war. They got those helicopters operating and brought them to Fort Riley and flew them around the post to give the troops a visual picture of what an Iraqi helicopter would look like. This is the kind of stuff we did. It was just fascinating. So the 1st Division was ready to go. We were itching to go. If you wanted to fight, we used to say, you've come to the right place.
And the second question I had, it was interesting you brought up the UAVs. U.S. Navy had UAVs. This was the last war the Iowa-class battleship got to participate in. USS Wisconsin, USS Missouri was off the coast laying down 16-inch gunfire. Naval surface fire support, it is different than the Army because we have computers on board the ship, a lot of automated process. One of our guns essentially counts as 4 as the Army's guns. No lack of courage is just because we have machines firing as fast as we do. Any part of the Army's training, do you integrate with the Navy at any point where the Army can take this area, the Navy takes this area, anything along those lines?
Well, we, as artillerymen, we all trained naval gunfire, so we knew about Anglicos and we knew about naval gunfire operations and so on and so forth. But typically the Navy, being the selfish service you were, kept your UAVs away from us, so we didn't know you had them. Next question.
All right, well, we do have to draw this evening to a close, so I do want to apologize if I did not get to anybody's questions, but Colonel Lingamfelter is going to be here afterwards for any lingering questions. I want to thank everybody so much for joining us at this evening's Date with History presentation. As always, on behalf of the Robert R. McCormick Foundation, I want to thank all of our veterans who are in attendance, both virtually and in person, for their service, especially tonight to our Desert Storm veterans. So if everybody can join me in a quick moment of thanks to our veterans who are joining us tonight. We hope to see you on Thursday, April 6th for Unraveling the Myth of Sergeant Alvin York. Colonel Lingamfelter's book is for sale in the back of the room. He is more than happy to sign a copy for you, as well as Colonel Gregory Fontenot's book is also for sale in the back of the room today as well. Thank you, folks. Have a lovely evening, and thank you for choosing to spend your time here at beautiful Cantini Park.